My presentation is really based on my PhD research, and within that research I'm very much focusing on the Irish deaf community, particularly their experiences in courts, prisons, workhouses and various institutions of that kind. Today I'll be talking about one particular deaf man called John Neville, who lived for many years in a workhouse in Parsonstown, or the new name for the town is Birr. He was there from the 1870s all the way up to round about 1921. I want to talk a little bit about my methodology and also where I'm getting my information from this evening. I've very much been using local newspapers. I found them to be a fantastically rich source of information. I know other researchers have tended to focus on Board of Guardians meeting minutes. And I have used those sources also. But for the story of John Neville's life, I found the newspapers far more useful, richer in detail, full of the details of the discussions and arguments of the boards of guardians and containing quotes of exactly what they've said. So in that way they're a little bit better than the Board of Guardian minutes, which are a little dry in comparison. So I've mentioned 4 local newspapers I've used here on the PowerPoint. The Board of Guardian minutes I have consulted in the Offaly County Archives. I've begun going through those minutes and picking bits of information out, but I still haven't finished everything. So really this presentation is a work in progress. I haven't completed all my research on John Neville as of yet. I'm still working through those Board of Guardian minutes. But I've got absolutely tons of information from the newspapers I'll be presenting tonight. So in looking at these sources, these newspaper articles and Board of Guardian minutes, one of the issues that I've come up with is the fact that these are sources that are written by hearing people. So hearing sources, as I think of them. That doesn't mean that I reject the use of them, of course. It just means it's slightly difficult when you read through a newspaper article whose tone is insulting to someone like John, or patronising, or making fun of him. It's very hard with these sources to get any sense of John's own voice, what he thought of his own life. That's a difficulty. It's hard to extract his voice, his thoughts, his views from these sources like newspaper articles. Sometimes you can get gleanings of them. And it's really interesting because John was very much a letter writer. And I feel that sometimes his letters reflect more of an authentic voice of the man. So why have I picked this character, John Neville, to write about? Well, first of all, there's plenty of information about him. I've come across lots of deaf people in workhouses, but nothing like the sheer amount of material that there is about John. Also, I have to say, in all my readings about John, he is a character. And he would have been very well known in Birr around the time because of the fact he was a character. But I don't want to treat, therefore, John as just being, he was a gas man, he was a good laugh, and to make him a figure of fun. Because I have seen quite a few times where these stories of, the local village dummy, these kind of stories can sometimes, the stories of the local village dummy, they're more played for comedy rather than a serious treatment of the person as a human being. So we have to remember that these stories often contain oppression, trauma, and especially if you're talking about an institutional context, perhaps years and years in an institution like the workhouse. It's easy sometimes to take that experience and make it a joke, to make fun of the person, and to reduce them to a local character, and I don't want to do that. But I also want to say that those who entered the workhouses, like John, had a low status while they were inmates in the workhouse compared to the workhouse staff. There was a clear power differential there, and perhaps a lack of ability to influence their own decisions. But John was somewhat in the middle between these two levels, and that's another thing that I find interesting about him. He also had agency. I don't mean agency as in an organization. What I mean is the ability to decide for himself what he was going to do rather than be a victim, let himself be the victim of his circumstances. He was an active man. He made decisions. He exercised power in those decisions that he made. Now, for any people in the deaf community watching, I'm sure you're very well aware of this, but if you're not familiar with the deaf community, this is some very important preliminary information. You'll see these three terms here. In the present day, none of these are considered acceptable. The deaf community does not encourage the use whatsoever of these three terms. So deaf sign language users would feel extremely offended by any current use of these three terms. And the preferred alternative is deaf with a capital D, which indicates membership of the deaf community, the deaf culture, use of Irish Sign Language, plus hearing loss. But capital D indicates that cultural sense of being deaf and that pride in being deaf. The three terms are products of a bygone age, but at the time, of course, they were used very much. The Board of Guardians minutes used these terms, newspaper articles also. And of course, at the time, deaf people themselves would have described themselves as, for example, a deaf mute, even though it will be unacceptable now. But we do have to accept that historically they were terms widely used. You will see a lot of sources I talk about tonight using these three terms. That doesn't mean that they're okay to use, it just means they're being shown in their historical context. I'll talk a little bit about the birth of the Irish poor law system, because it is intimately connected to the workhouses. And the workhouse system in Ireland comes from the 1838 Irish Poor Law Act. So from the passing of that act, you saw workhouses being built all over the country, initially 130 poor law unions being declared across Ireland. Each union had a workhouse, one workhouse per union. After the famine, there were more built, additional workhouses built, and unions put in place. So each union had a workhouse that was administered by a Board of Guardians. And the Board of Guardians was locally elected. There were locally elected men for the most part. And they would have decided, they would have made big decisions about the running of the workhouse and the spending of the poor rate, which was a local taxation raised within the poor law union. So landowners would have had to pay a poor rate, this kind of form of local taxation, and that money, the poor rate, was used to run the workhouse and purchase food and clothing and so on for the inmates. So this system began in 1838, but the workhouses weren't full immediately when they opened. It took a little while, really until the Irish famine, for crowds and crowds of people to start piling into workhouses, and you saw the rapid spread of disease and a high death rate during the famine times in workhouses. It was really a terrible place to be. I mean, there were never particularly nice places to be, but they were particularly dreadful during the famine times. So what happened in the workhouse? What kind of place was it? Well, it wasn't compulsory to go to the workhouse. You were never forced to go there. You were never sent to the workhouse. People made the decision to go to the workhouse. But generally, when they had absolutely no other choice, they didn't know what to do, where to go to live, so they went to the workhouse. Once they were in there, it wasn't the case that they weren't allowed to leave again. You could leave once you gave a few hours notice that you wanted to go, and then after about 3 hours or so, you could leave the workhouse. You see this term here in the PowerPoint, less eligibility. What this means is that the workhouse was designed to have very poor conditions. They didn't want to attract people to the workhouse. They certainly weren't trying to grab people and throw them into this institution. They always wanted the workhouse to be particularly poor conditions so that people wouldn't come, so that people would actually deliberately avoid the workhouse. That was a deliberate decision on the part of the poor law authorities. The Board of Guardians wanted to keep it below what would be considered generally an acceptable standard of living. And if you did go in there, there was separation between men and women, boys and girls, families would be split up, mothers separated from their young children. So it was really quite an intense experience. There was very harsh discipline within the workhouse walls. You could be punished. So, for example, one particular harsh punishment was being locked in a dark room, a confined space for 12 hours or 24 hours. The diet was terrible. The conditions were terrible. It was a cold and dirty place generally. And you had to do work. So women might do something like sewing, men might do stone breaking or farm work or various kinds of work like that. And here we see an example, an artist's impression of a workhouse. The front of a workhouse at the gates. Tons of people in poverty, desperate to get in. Now, this reflects the famine times. It wouldn't have been like this through the duration of the whole workhouse system, but in the times of the Irish famine, you would see large numbers trying to get into the workhouses, as you see there. So the famine was a terrible experience. 1 million had to emigrate and 1 million died. After the famine, the workhouses around Ireland began to change. Those entering the workhouse, the profile of those people changed too. So able-bodied people, so-called, during the famine there was a high number of them. People who physically could work, but there was no work to be found. So they had to enter the workhouse. The number of those people in the workhouses decreased because work was available, or maybe emigration. So able-bodied people were a smaller proportion of the workhouse population. But the amount of inmates in workhouses that were not able-bodied, that had disabilities, began to increase after the famine, as well as groups like old people, people with disabilities, as I say, the aged, the infirm. These were categories of people. The infirm would have been people with illnesses or diseases. The number of those people, the proportion began to increase. You also began to see an increase in the number of homeless people, tramps or vagrants as they were also known. The numbers going into the workhouse increased of those kinds of inmates. And the Board of Guardians, after a while, began to incur more responsibility through legislation. So hospitals, public health, each workhouse had its own hospital attached to it that provided free public health care. So you had people coming to avail of that as well in the workhouse hospitals. So the workhouses and the Board of Guardians were changing, but you still had stigma. People did not want to go into the workhouse. It was the last thing they wanted to do. It was associated with shame, with embarrassment, with stigma. And after Irish independence, the workhouse system was shut down, but many of the buildings remained. They were converted to hospitals or county homes. Workhouses often looked like this. Most of them would have looked something like this. And one architect, George Wilkinson, was responsible. He was an English architect, responsible for the plans, the similar plans for workhouses all over the country. There were some changes to the design depending on the size of the town and the projected number of inmates, but they all followed roughly a similar design of Wilkinson's. And when we look at Birr Workhouse in a few minutes, bear in mind what this workhouse plan looks like and make that comparison. So I'll show you where Birr Workhouse is, if you're wondering where it is. Now, I have to put my hand up here, hand on heart, and say, very honestly, I have never been to Birr. I've never visited the town. Maybe some of you are currently thinking, for God's sake, you're giving this lecture about Birr history. You've never even been here. So my apologies. But I will say that my research is national research, but just Birr provides the best example. And that's why I'm picking it. And certainly I'd intended to visit Birr Workhouse at one stage. But then, of course, COVID-19 came along and the lockdown meant that I wasn't able to visit. But I really do want to have a drive out to Birr and see this workhouse building at some stage. And maybe if there's any Birr people watching, you know the workhouse well, but I'll show you where it is nonetheless. You can see it here. And you can see the workhouse. If you look at the overhead view, the plan of the workhouse here, it's very similar to that design of George Wilkinson's that we've just seen. You can see how the building is structured, and you might just be able to see there the building itself was split in half, one half being for men, and you might just be able to see the small writing there, men's yard, and then beside that we see women's yard. So there was separation there. You weren't allowed to talk between men and women or interact. And then at the front of the building you can see girls' yard and boys' yard. I have a few photographs here to show you a little bit what workhouse life would have been like. Now these aren't pictures of Birr Workhouse, but they would have been of similar workhouses around the country. These photographs show a higher standard of life in the workhouses than in previous times. These were taken around about 1895, so improvements had taken place from the preceding years where it was an awful place to be entirely. Now, one of the pictures depicts a group of so-called lunatics. It's another one of these words that, like deaf and dumb, was used quite widely at the time, but we consider terrible now. So each workhouse would have had one small ward within it for so-called lunatics. And we're talking about people maybe with fairly mild learning disabilities or mental health issues. Serious cases like that would have been transferred to the local asylum. But the asylum, if a case wasn't particularly serious, might discharge such patients and they would find their way back to the workhouses quite often. So let's talk a little bit about deaf people in the workhouses. Now these are figures from here in Ireland, and they're taken from 1851, 1861 and 1871. And we see a comparison here between the general population of Ireland and the proportion of them in workhouses, and then the red bar, which is the proportion of deaf people nationally in workhouses. So I'm focusing on proportions, percentages, because the numbers themselves of deaf people in the workhouses may seem quite small, just 200 or so. But if you look at that as a proportion of the overall deaf community all over the country, it's quite large. So in 1851 we can see that it's almost twice as high for deaf as it is for hearing. In 1861, the general population in the workhouses, that proportion has gone way down, but not so much for deaf people. It's only gone down a little bit. And then it's something like 5 times greater for deaf people than it is for the general population. And in 1871, that gap has actually got worse. So even though the number of deaf people in workhouses might be absolutely quite small, it's that proportion that's very important. And of course, over time, you might be forgiven for expecting that because deaf schools had been opened during the 19th century, the amount of deaf people with education had increased. That would mean that the workhouse population with deaf people in it would have been people without education, but not so. So we can see that the figures here, if you're talking about the deaf inhabitants of workhouses, the percentage of them who had been educated is increasing. So just because a deaf person had attended school and received an education did not necessarily mean that they would never enter the workhouse. It means that ending up in the workhouse was certainly still a possibility. There's a lecture online, an excellent lecture that talks about Birr Workhouse, and I'm going to refer to it here. It's given by Professor Mary Daly, and she talks about Birr during the same time frame that I'm talking about John Neville. In 1905, there's some figures here from that particular year about the number of people in Birr Workhouse. So I'll show you here. So there was 255 inmates altogether. You can see there's a number of homeless inmates. There's 17 so-called ins and outs. That would mean people that would often find themselves returning to the workhouse. There's some long stay inmates. There's people who came to the workhouse for hospital purposes rather than being inmates of the workhouse. There are military pensioners, maybe, who don't have anywhere else to stay. And there's a lot of children. So just to say that not so much for the Birr Union, but certainly nationally, if you look at all these categories, deaf people are in these categories all around the country in workhouses. For Birr, really, in this time period, there's really just the one deaf person, who is John Neville. If you look at the census of Ireland in 1901 and 1911, again we have some figures as to how many people are in the workhouse. It's 200 or 210 or so. And the census forms actually show John Neville here. So here you go. Now the census forms only have the initials of inmates. They don't have the full names. So you can see here Jan. So you'd know well that that was John A. Neville. And then you can also see the mention of him being so-called deaf and dumb. Now Mary Daly, in her lecture, which is an excellent lecture, and I'd recommend you to have a look, but at that time Mary Daly would have said, you know, this is about the time of the 1901-1911 censuses, that these disabilities like being deaf or blind and lame made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to find work. Disabilities that condemned them to poverty and to long-term life in the workhouse. So that's a quote from Professor Daly. Now, I wouldn't be in full agreement with this. Just because you were deaf, it meant that you would never find work? That's not quite true. I mean, at the time in 1901, you had a high percentage of deaf adults with occupations. So these are figures from the census here. So 52% of so-called deaf and dumb people had a specified occupation on the census. So a specifically mentioned job that they had. So it didn't mean that they were condemned to a life without employment or a life in the workhouse. But at the time, we also have to remember that deaf people might have had education, they might have had the appropriate skills. That didn't necessarily mean that hearing people would have treated them as able to do the job. So quite often deaf people might have suffered from not having enough work because of preconceptions of hearing society. And deaf people, when they went into workhouses, would often, have to do work. I mean, that's what you're in the workhouse for. So, I mean, the master or the other workhouse staff would have given them work to do, whether they were non-deaf or deaf. And I found evidence of this. Work was given to deaf inmates in areas such as nursing. They wouldn't have been trained nurses, but just as other pauper inmates in the workhouses, without any training, they would have been put to work in the infirmaries as nurses, not really knowing what they were doing half the time. They would have been put to work as shoemakers or tailors where appropriate. They would have been given odd jobs. Sometimes you might have had inmates with an intellectual disability, and deaf inmates were sometimes appointed to look after or care for those inmates. So lots of work was given to deaf people, and that kind of work was given to everyone hearing and deaf. It wasn't the case that deaf people weren't given work because they weren't considered able for it. They were given work just as much as other inmates. And the Board of Guardians occasionally said about certain deaf inmates that they did their job very well. At other times they were mocked for their lack of skill. And quite often the kind of work that was given to deaf inmates would have been very menial work. So it was kind of handy for the Guardians to unload that work on deaf people. Now, finally, to talk about John Neville. I want to talk about John's mother. And John's mother was deaf as well. His mother was named Mary, or also Molly Neville. So Molly was a nickname, and she was deaf. It looked like she never went to a deaf school, and she spent her life as a beggar, or what you'll often see, another word for this is a mendicant. So she would have wandered the countryside begging. And I have a picture here that I've picked as an example of what a beggar woman looked like. This obviously isn't a picture of John Neville's mother, but you can imagine Molly going around place to place with her child in her arms begging for money as a deaf woman. So how do I know that she was deaf? Well, I was looking around for John's baptism record, and in the course of looking around the Birr area, I only found one record that was a candidate, and it was this one, and it mentions that his mother wasn't married, so the word illegitimate is used, but also the same baptism record mentions that Molly was a deaf mute, which you can see here. And that's really interesting. That means that John was deaf and grew up with a mother who was deaf as well. So I suppose I had all these imaginings that when John was a young baby and was growing up as a toddler, that he had a mother that could sign to him and they could communicate without any hassle. That wouldn't have been the case if his mother would have been hearing. Maybe communication would have been far more difficult, but John and Molly possibly had that benefit, and that benefit might have accrued to John as he grew up. He might have found acquiring language a lot more easy because he had the early exposure to language. Now, I don't have any evidence of this, of course. That's just a flight of fantasy on my part. So in 1870, Molly actually died when John was still a young boy. And she would have died as a result of a train accident. So she was killed instantly. After her death, there was an inquest. And that was an attempt to try and find out what had happened. And the newspaper report about the inquest gives a lot of information about Molly's life. It says that she had been in the area of Birr for some years. She had been a mendicant. It was also mentioned that at some stage prior to her death, she had a child, but it wasn't known where the child was. She was 30 years old. She was deaf and dumb. And originally she came from Dublin. That was what one person said. And that she still had a sister in Dublin, apparently. So I haven't been able to follow up on the research about Molly Neville's family tree, unfortunately. But it looks like she just didn't hear the train on the way, and the train hit her and she died. And the child wasn't around at the time, according to this inquest. No one seemed to know where the child was, which is interesting because years later, John would have told a bit of a different story. John himself would have said, well, my mother died while I was still in her arms. So John apparently was in Molly's arms when she died from this train crash. So the story about the train, that part remains, but apparently John told the story that he had survived and his mother died. So that's the story he told himself later. I can't say if that's a true story or not, but if you go back to the inquest and the report in the newspaper about the inquest, it mentions nothing about a child being present at all. And another important piece of evidence is that 1870 is the year that Molly died. But it was a year previous to that John was sent to school in Dublin, in Cabra. That was 1869, and the Board of Guardians made a decision to fund John's education. They paid St. Joseph's School in Cabra, and John was sent there to be educated. So I'm sure many deaf people watching are very, very familiar with this school for deaf boys. And the Catholic Institute for the Deaf and Dumb, as it was known back then, had a regular report, and it mentions John arriving at the school. So you can see at the same time, two boys from Birr were sent up, John Neville and another boy called Francis Castelli. So they were both sent to St. Joseph's at the same time, and at the time 6 years was the average term that you would spend in St. Joseph's before returning home. So it looked like John stayed the full 6 years, and then when that term expired he came back to the workhouse. So how did he end up in the workhouse in the first place to be sent to the school? Well, I have a feeling that Molly might have realised that she couldn't look after her child herself, and so she would have given the child to the workhouse. She then died a year later, and when John came back, maybe he was told how his mother died and found out that way. So John went off for the full 6 years studying, and he came back to the workhouse then. But the Board of Guardians, I think, were a little bit disappointed or annoyed that John returned, and there's a bit of information here about why. The Board of Guardians, when John came back, felt that he should have a trade at this stage. He should know tailoring or shoemaking or something like that. But he didn't seem to have a trade, and so they wrote to the school and asked for an explanation. And the school replied that in the past 6 years they had tried to teach John tailoring and shoemaking, but it was found he was incapable of learning either. And the Board of Guardians at that stage wanted maybe to return him to Cabra, and for Cabra to take him back, but the school said, look, that won't be of any benefit to John. So it looked like the workhouse was stuck with John for the time being. So John stayed in the workhouse, but after a while did quite well there. He came back there in 1875, and in 1888, at least, there was mention in the newspapers of him being the workhouse messenger. And plenty of references after that year to him being the workhouse messenger. Oh, John A., he's the very well-known workhouse messenger in Birr. That's the way the newspapers would always talk about him. So he would be referred to as the workhouse messenger, locally. So we can see three pieces of evidence for that here, that John was well thought of by the Guardians and by local people. The celebrated John A. Neville, we can see here the first reference to him being a tip-top messenger, a most extraordinary man, the redoubtable deaf-mute who so worthily fills the post of workhouse messenger, and the celebrated deaf-mute without whom we would not be able to manage. And he had other skills as well. He was able to do work with glass, so he was working as a glazier at some points for the workhouse. So if there was ever a broken pane of glass, he'd be able to replace that. And what's more, John was working in the workhouse, but not in a paid staff capacity. He wasn't a workhouse officer of any kind. So it was free labour for the workhouse. They didn't have to pay him wages. They would sometimes, he'd get other benefits. So he had a bit more freedom to come and go from the workhouse than other inmates. Occasionally he might need money for some expenses that he'd receive, but he didn't receive regular wages for a staff position. But if there was ever a broken pane of glass around the workhouse, rather than paying a professional glazier, they could just call on John to do the work, and John was very eager to do that. So you can see the Board of Guardians here actually admitting that that was the case, that John saved them a lot of money. Later on, what's really interesting is that John started to do some clerical work in the Union. So for an inmate of the workhouse, someone who was that poor, someone who was a pauper in the workhouse, to be asked to help out there, that's quite extraordinary. And we can see here a quote that John was well able to do this kind of work. He knew where all the paperwork was. And at the time, of course, St. Joseph's had a sign language based education, and I think the result of that was an excellent standard of literacy. And that's why he was so good at clerical work. And the second piece of evidence here is from after John died. There was a newspaper article about his life, basically saying what a great character he was. And it's mentioned in this piece that his services in relation to clerical work were often requisitioned by various officials. He was often called to help out. He knew where all the different papers and documents were. So not only that, but if any workhouse positions, any paid workhouse posts came up, any salaried staff positions, straight away John would apply, and he'd make it very clear he was looking for this job. And that was a constant theme through this period. So he applied for jobs like workhouse porter, caretaker in the workhouse dispensary, and wardsman. So those are 3 times that he applied for jobs, and they certainly weren't the only times. The local newspaper found this quite amusing, and one particular quote says, "Oh, the irrepressible John Neville, the deaf-mute messenger boy, who is generally looked at as an admirable kind of half-witted loon. But the ordinary individual would require to get up early to overreach him. He is an ambitious youth. He is tendered ere now for the chimney sweeping of the workhouse. And we believe he would apply right away if the office of master or clerk to fall vacant. So that's a quote from the newspaper about John. Now, unfortunately, I haven't come across a picture of John, but over the years, the newspaper has mentioned various aspects of his appearance, and I've taken a few here. So at one stage, the newspaper says that John is the always smiling mute messenger. Then there's two references, funnily enough, to this next part. Apparently, John had some kind of headgear, some hat, and it was a Turkish-style hat. I'll show you an example of what it looks like. This isn't a picture of John, but you'll see the kind of hat I'm talking about. So here we go. It was called a fez. So apparently John had a fez and would wear that on his trips from the workhouse into town, and the populace of the town would have maybe had a good laugh at John coming and going with the fez on his head. Another reference then says that John had union livery, a workhouse uniform with scarlet facings. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what that uniform, what that livery looked like, and certainly if anyone out there can help me with that, please get in touch. Just one more thing about John's appearance that's quite funny is a mention of false teeth. So John was mad about getting a set of second-hand false teeth. He really wanted this. He would have written letter after letter to the Board of Guardians asking for assistance in getting this set of false teeth. He would have said, my teeth are no good anymore. I can't chew my food. I need these false teeth. Later on, John actually, get this, wrote to the king, Edward VII, about his teeth, asking for assistance in getting a new set of teeth. And it looked like Edward, well, later on, John said, he promised me a set of false teeth. And then he didn't get them. And then when the new king, Edward's son, George V, came into power, just after he became king, John Neville was sending him letters saying, your father promised me a set of false teeth. And later still we have another story, kind of a shocking story. It looked like John was having plenty of problems with his teeth over the years. And one letter said that John acted as dentist, in his own words, previously, and removed all his teeth using twine and his foot and nail, which looked like he would tie twine around the bad tooth, tie the other end around his toe, jerk his toe and pull out the teeth. And he removed all of his teeth that way by 1914. Interesting. So as I say, John was a consummate letter writer. He would send a lot of letters to the Board of Guardians over the years. And quite often the local newspaper would reproduce these because the local newspaper's reporters, the journalists, were allowed into the Board of Guardians meetings. And they would take notes of what was being said. And if John wrote a letter to the Guardians, that letter would then be read out for the Guardians present, and sometimes the journalist would write this down, the content of the letter. And that's how I found so many of these letters in the newspaper over the years. And he had a really good level of English. Now, there's a little bit of traces of deaf English, so-called, in his letters. So, that way that you could tell it's a deaf person writing a letter. It's a kind of a way that deaf people would sometimes write that's slightly different, but certainly a good level of English nonetheless. And he'd write to the Guardians to offer them advice, something that he felt that they should do, or he would ask for something in connection with his job as a messenger. He might need a new coat or an umbrella. He'd ask for other things like a lamp. At one stage, he wanted a new trumpet. And the trumpet was for getting people's attention, because as John said, he wasn't able to do that with his voice, so the trumpet would do it for him. At one stage he asked for a bicycle, a rainproof coat. Interestingly enough, at one stage he asked for a copy of recently passed legislation, and that caused a bit of a laugh at the Board of Guardians meetings. Why is he looking for a copy of this new law? And they kind of made fun of John. Oh, he's going to study the legislation. But he was well able to read legislation. And he wanted, for his own purposes, to go through this. And he asked the Guardians for a copy, and that was rejected, and it was just laughed off. And at one stage, it was kind of strange, he asked for special discs to improve his hearing. I've no idea what that refers to, but apparently he wrote a letter about that at one stage to the Guardian. So about a wide range of subjects and a large number of letters would have been sent over the years by John A. Neville. And so here's an example of some of the advice he gave to the Guardians at one stage. At the time, as I've mentioned, the workhouse was quite a cruel place, very strict, a lot of rules and discipline, and one of the rules was you had to go to bed fairly early. So in 1888, inmates had to be in bed by 7 o'clock in the evening. You couldn't stay any longer than 7 o'clock, you had to go to bed at that time. And John made the point that this was cruel and wrote a letter saying, this is unfair, this is too strict. And the newspaper reproduced some of that letter and said that, the celebrated deaf-mute John Ambrose Neville says he has considered the subject and is forced to the conclusion that the present system is unsound in theory and cruel in practice. John says, what could be a greater hardship than to compel the inmates to retire to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening? So John was concerned about his fellow inmates, obviously. He was worried about the paupers that he shared the workhouse with and wrote to the Guardians. And I suppose we would agree with him now. We would say that 7 o'clock is a ridiculously early time to be sent to bed. But the Board of Guardians just laughed at John's letter at the time. Some more advice later on. Somewhat similarly, there was a particular time when the workhouse was locked up in the evenings. And John wanted to extend that by half an hour. So let's say he or someone else was visiting town and they were to come back a little bit late. John was saying, look, let's make it easier for them by extending the lockup time for half an hour. So he sent off a letter to that in that regard to the Guardians. The Guardians had a discussion about this and said, actually, you know what, he's right. And they extended the lockup time from 8:30 to 9 o'clock. And that was after John had written a letter raising this subject that this decision was made. For the summer months anyway. So obviously John had influence to some degree. Here's some more John Neville advice. At one stage he said this other inmate, is unstable. He should be sent off to a lunatic asylum. And then this second letter, he was complaining about the big boys in the workhouse. So these would have been younger boys also in the workhouse, and they would have been making trouble. At one stage they ripped up all these flowers. They were bold boys, they were wild. The flowers were owned by the nuns who at that stage worked in the workhouse. And they'd obviously planted these lovely flowers, and next thing these wild, bold boys came along and ripped them all up. John was incredibly annoyed by this and wrote a letter to the Guardian saying that this was terrible behaviour and they should be sent to a reformatory school, which at the time was a special kind of school that would really whip you into shape if you were a young man who was misbehaving. Now, John was no angel himself. If you go back to the early years when he was in the workhouse, he was in trouble a few times. So here's two examples. The first example mentions that he was involved in a shindy, some kind of fight, I think. And then the second example here says that at times John had been guilty of insubordination. So he was directly told to do something and he refused or he ignored those orders. So he was insubordinate, not obeying orders, and that kind of trouble apparently John was well known for. And at one stage he took this further and actually escaped over the workhouse wall. Now at the time the rules of the workhouse said that this was completely forbidden. You could of course give your 3 hours notice and then leave the workhouse through the proper channels, but you couldn't just decide that you wanted to leave and scale the walls. But that's what John did. He got over the wall. He came back then to the workhouse and the master asked him, how did you get out in the first place? And, I think he was asking this through sign language or gesture. And John replied in signs that he had climbed over the wall. Now after this incident, John was punished. He got 12 hours kept in confinement under lock and key. And at the same time, the Board of Guardians wrote a letter to Cabra, to St. Joseph's School, where he had been to school, saying, look, what can we do about this man? Can you do anything for us? But they were told by Cabra that there was nothing more that they could do. Now, this is a really interesting example of one time that John saw something he was concerned about and informed, but then got in trouble for it. So one evening, John went into town, went into Birr, and saw a small boy who was from the workhouse in the town, and communicated with the boy in some way. Maybe it was through writing notes with the boy. He asked the boy, what are you doing here? And the boy replied, oh, I'm waiting for this man who has hired me out of the workhouse. But John kept talking to the boy, and apparently the boy was there for some hours in town because the man was off drinking. And when the man finally returned, John told the boy, after the man returned very drunkenly, John told the boy to go back home to the workhouse. And then the man returning, who was very drunk at this stage, gave John a punch and started kicking him and attacking him. So after this incident, John wanted to relate this terrible incident in a letter to say how cruel the man was to John personally, and if he was going to be cruel like that to me, it's going to be even worse to this young boy. But the letter was not sent by John to the Board of Guardians this time. It was sent to a different body, the superior body to the Board of Guardians, which was known as the Local Government Board. It would have been responsible for all the workhouses in Ireland, and John sent the letter to the Local Government Board, but didn't inform the Board of Guardians of Birr first. And the Local Government Board read this letter from John and realised that what had happened was against the law, because the small boy was only 10 years old, and the legislation at the time said that you had to be 12 years old if a workhouse child was to be taken out for work. They had to be over 12. And here's this boy only 10 years old been taken out. So they wrote to the Board of Guardians, a little bit of a slap in the wrist. This is against the law. How could you allow this to happen? And the LGB sent a copy of John Neville's original letter back to the Board of Guardians to let them know where this complaint had come from. And the Board of Guardians were not happy about this at all. They were furious. They said, John Neville is after writing directly to the Local Government Board and hasn't even come to us. He's gone above our heads. They really felt that this was terrible, that an inmate in Birr Workhouse would do this. And one man said, you can see it here in the newspaper article, if he commences sending letters, he will often have us in hot water. So, he'll make a lot of trouble for us. So it looks like the Guardians were a bit afraid, maybe that they were doing things wrong or not by the approved manner. But if the Local Government Board were aware of that through letters from people like John Neville, they'd be in trouble. So they had a discussion about what to do about John. They couldn't force him out of the workhouse, because if he was genuinely poor, they had to admit him. They couldn't keep him in the workhouse, because the legislation wouldn't allow for that. He was allowed to ask to leave, and then he was allowed to leave. So you couldn't kind of treat it like a prison that he was stuck in. So essentially they fired him. They took away his messenger job from him, and he was to be treated just like other inmates in the future. They also gave him some pretty hard work to do in the meantime. A week later, John writes a letter of apology to the Guardians. He's very, very apologetic. He said, it was too late for me to bring the letter back after I'd sent it. I apologise wholeheartedly. I'll never write to the Local Government Board again. I'll never mind about any person again. And I suppose he asks for pity. He says, I'm a poor deaf mute, I'm innocent, and so on. So he's basically on his knees begging for forgiveness at this stage in this long letter to the Guardians. And the local newspaper reproduces this letter. So the Board of Guardians has a short discussion about this, and they say, fair enough, okay, you're back as messenger. But I have to say, it's a bit embarrassing, because the reason the letter was written in the first place was out of concern for a child. John didn't realise that what was happening was against the law. He simply had a concern that this man was being cruel to this 10-year-old boy. And in the end, for raising his concern, he gets punished. He has to be on his knees begging for forgiveness for his actions. And at times, John was quite eager to leave the workhouse. At one point in 1892, he wrote a long letter to the guardians saying that he wanted to leave the workhouse. He wanted to leave Birr Union and never come back. And it's funny because one guardian said in response to that at the meeting, "Oh, we couldn't spare him if he left. What would we do? We need him," basically. And there was a bit of a laugh at that, but my reading of that would be, maybe there's a bit of seriousness to that. Maybe if he attempted to leave, there was other ways in which he could be made to stay. Who knows? There's another example here as well where John said that he wanted to leave the workhouse and look for work. Now, at that particular time, the guardians each donated a little bit of their own money towards giving it to John and helping him when he left the workhouse. And that would often happen. John would need something and the board of guardians would have a whip round and give him money. So the guardians would often be willing to do that, each donate a little bit privately to John for food or clothes or whatever he needed. And sometimes John really missed Cabra. And you can imagine what it was like, I suppose, for him to think back of his days in school where everyone around him learned sign language and knew sign language. There was no miscommunication. The Christian brothers who were teaching him all were fluent signers as well. So there was no problems, no barriers of communication. And then you're back in a workhouse where people are speaking to you. You can't understand what they're saying. There's rules, there's discipline. So over time, John expressed a wish to go back to Cabra the odd time. And and he'd write a letter to the guardians to say, can you please send me back to Cabra? And this is a fairly early example, asking to go back with a policeman. But as I said, Cabra basically said, look, we can't help you. Cabra wasn't able to help him because they had limited funds, they had limited space. But one thing that was very well known about Joseph's is their past pupil retreats. So at the time, every year or every 2 years, you would have a regular past pupil retreat. So deaf ex-pupils of St. Joseph's would come back to Cabra for a period of prayer, socialising, meeting old friends. Everyone would be using sign language with each other and catching up with friends and teachers. And John would regularly attend these retreats. From at least 1886 right up to 1920, we have references to him attending these retreats. So it looked like he went fairly regularly. We see the photograph here, that's slightly later, it's from 1950, but you can see the sheer number of people at one of these retreats. So you can imagine a very similar sized crowd meeting up previous to that in John's time. So how did John get there? How did he attend these retreats? It appears that he walked all the way from Birr up to Dublin. And one of the newspaper reports mentions this, the fact that he walked. He walked all the way there and all the way back. So I tried to work it out. How long would that take you to walk all that way? So here we go. 26 hours. Now, that's 26 hours given modern roads that are smooth and very easy to walk on. So at the time, I'd say it would have taken at least 2 full days, maybe a quick sleep in between, to walk that distance. But John did it, and he was willing to do it, to make that trek. And he would always ask the Board of Guardians if they would be able to help him out with a new set of clothes or a new pair of shoes for the past pupil retreats in Cabra. And of course, if you were walking for 2 days on a route like that, you'd need a new pair of shoes. The pair of shoes you would have originally had would be destroyed. But the Board of Guardians were generally willing to do that. So again, they would use their own money rather than the Poor Law Union's money. Had a whip round and given them some money for a new pair of shoes or new clothes. Occasionally, John, when he got to the retreat, would, he'd really enjoy himself, and then he'd write a letter back to the guardians to say how much he was enjoying himself and what was happening. This example here isn't from a retreat, but it is about Christmas entertainments that were held one year in Cabra. So there'd be prayer, there'd be a drama given in sign language attended by deaf people from all over the country. And John wrote this letter here about what a great time he was having. So this is John's own letter. He says, "I have not spent such a happy Christmas for 20 years. The Cabra brothers kindly received me and said I was heartily welcome. There were more than 200 deaf mutes present at the drama. They were in roars of laughter for over an hour, in which I heartily joined. I shall never forget that pleasant night. All were delighted." Right? So that's a lovely letter, and you can see that John was really attached to Cabra, to the deaf community, to sign language, all the way through those years, even though he was away at the workhouse. And he also had a concern about other deaf people in his locality. So we can see here the Parsonstown Union is just north of Rosscray Union. So there was a workhouse in each of these unions. You can see here in the map where they're located. John at one stage found out that Rosscray Workhouse had a deaf inmate and was incredibly excited, wrote a letter to the guardians of Parsonstown and requested them to ask the Rosscray guardians to move that deaf man to Birr. John's letter said to the guardians, "The monotony of workhouse life oppressed him very much. He therefore suggested that another deaf mute, at present located in the Rosscray Workhouse, should be transferred to the Birr Union to keep him company." But, what was the response? The reading of the letter created roars of laughter amongst the guardians. Another time, John found out of something similar happening in the Tullamore Workhouse. The Tullamore Board of Guardians meeting was published in a local paper, and it mentioned that there was going to be a deaf man to be transferred to Tullamore. That deaf man's name was Pierce Cody. So he was going to be transferred to Tullamore Workhouse. He originally was from New Ross in County Wexford, but when John saw the proceedings in the newspaper mentioning Cody being transferred to Tullamore, again he became very excited, wrote a letter to the Tullamore Guardians, their Board of Guardians, and said the following. This is part of his letter. "I am a deaf mute. I'm educated in the same institution, and I know Pierce Cody so well, I would walk all the way to Tullamore by road if I would be allowed to see him, if he is retained in your union workhouse." So again, we can see John's interest in meeting other deaf people like himself. But what happened in the end is that Pierce Cody was transferred back to his home area of New Ross in the end. And again, we have an example a little bit later in 1912 of this. At the time, another boy who was deaf had been sent from Birr Union. His name was Pat Malone. He'd been sent up to Cabra for his education, to St. Joseph's School. He was aged around 8 years old at the time. And John, a short time after Pat Malone had been sent, wrote a letter to the guardians asking for some assistance, some financial assistance no doubt, to go to, if the Board of Guardians would help him out, that he would then go to visit Dublin. He wanted to visit Cabra and the Deaf Mutes Club. But he also said that he wanted to visit young Pat Malone to see how he was going on at school. So you can see that John was really attached to other deaf people. He had that sense of community. That was deep in his heart. Another interesting thing about John is that he was a very proud Irishman, very patriotic. So the time we're talking about, especially 1912 to 1914 or so, is a time when all around Ireland the Home Rule campaign was spreading. So it was a campaign for Home Rule for Ireland. So what you had at the time was more people all around the country wanting a parliament of their own. Not a parliament making decisions for Ireland in Westminster, but Home Rule, an Irish Parliament. And there was political campaigns and a movement towards that. And John felt very similarly to other Irishmen in that respect. This is John Redmond giving a speech. And he was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. So the speeches at Home Rule meetings of John Redmond and other politicians would have been reproduced in the local papers. John no doubt read these speeches and was greatly interested. And he mentions Home Rule in some of his letters. Here's one letter to the Guardians where John says, "The great trumpet has been sounded about Home Rule. I would be glad to have a Parliament of our own in Dublin. I hope to have it in Ireland alone." So you can see, very proud, patriotic Irishmen there. And these are the Irish Volunteers. They were, I suppose, a military force that were created at the time in response to Ulster setting up their Ulster Volunteer Force. And that group was established because they wanted to stop the progress of Home Rule, and the Irish Volunteers saw a threat to Home Rule as a result and set up this military group to make sure that the Home Rule Bill was passed. And that movement grew, more people joined and began training and drilling. John was hugely interested in this. So the Irish Volunteers would have meetings, and there was a meeting of them at one stage in Tullamore. John wanted to go and attend. So he wrote to the Guardians to say, "Please, can you give me some financial assistance to help me go to Tullamore for this meeting?" And then he said, "Oh, if I had a big trumpet, I would blow it for Home Rule." So there you go. The Guardians had a bit of a laugh at the wording of that letter from John. And one man said in response, "Oh, he ought to go and join Jim Larkin." So Jim Larkin being, as many people would know, a Dublin-based trade unionist. And then John wrote to the Guardians and wanted specifically to join the Volunteers. He said that he wrote a letter to the Guardians saying, "I hope that all the members of the Board of Guardians will be re-elected. I hope one day there'll be a Roman Catholic king for Ireland." Another letter then, he asked for clothes to fit him to join the Volunteers. But the Board of Guardians, in response to this, just laughed and dismissed this request. So it's a little bit... It's quite difficult when you think about that. John was obviously a man that wanted to fight for Ireland. And if you compare it to Northern Ireland, the UVF at the time, Ulster Volunteer Force, there were deaf members of that force. Whereas here in the southern part of Ireland, the idea of a deaf person joining the Irish Volunteers is considered something ridiculous and laughable. So after World War I broke out, a lot of the Irish Volunteers decided that they were willing to join the British Army, but only if, after the war had been won, that Ireland would get its own parliament. So a lot of volunteers made the decision then to join the British Army on that basis. And it looks like John would have agreed with that way of thinking. Because in 1916, just a little bit before the Easter Rising, that hadn't happened just at that point, but the local newspaper had a journalist who found out that in the workhouse, on the walls, a poem had been written. And John Neville was the one that had informed the journalist about this poem. So the journalist transcribed the poem and it was published. But the journalist himself mentioned after the poem was reproduced that he felt that John Neville was the author of the poem. Now, I can't say for definite. I had a quick Google search to see if I could find a poem that had matching words. And maybe people watching might recognise the words of this poem. Maybe it isn't original. But certainly the journalist felt that John A. Neville was the author of this poem written on the workhouse walls. So I show you the poem. I'm not going to fully translate it for you into ISL. I'll leave you to read it. But the gist of it really is about, we are poor people, we are paupers, and together we're going to stop tramping, we're going to stop roaming the country, we're going to get together, we're going to go over to Belgium, we're going to fight against the Germans. So it's like a rousing cry to battle. So a poem of patriotism and pride. Now in 1921, two important periods for the purposes of our lecture came to an end. John himself passed away, but the Birr Workhouse also closed down. So these two things both happened in 1921, very, very nearly the same time, the death of John and the closure of the workhouse. Now, I have searched in vain for John's official death certificate. I cannot locate it yet. So if anyone watching can assist me with that, I'd be very grateful. I just know that he died in 1921 through the newspaper because it mentioned an article. It contained an article about John being very attached to the Birr Workhouse. It also mentioned that there had been some discussion in advance of this that the Birr Workhouse might be transferred to Tullamore, and that John was not a fan of this idea at all. He wanted the institution to stay open in Birr. So he passed away in 1921. As to where he's buried, I'm not exactly sure, but I have a feeling it's probably the graveyard attached to the workhouse. There is a workhouse near a graveyard near the workhouse where there's something like 4,000 people buried from the famine times right up to the closure of the workhouse. But there aren't individual gravestones for this graveyard. It's just one single cross that we can see here. And after the workhouse closed, the building was used for light industry at periods after 1921. The building itself remained intact for quite a long time. It was in 2017, though, that there was a fire that at the time the guards believed may have been started maliciously. Did huge damage to the building again. So I don't know, maybe Birr natives can tell me if there's been any development in who started that fire. But the building itself at the time was seen to be soon, at the point of collapse. So you had the Birr Historical Society saying that it needed to be preserved, work needed to be started on that as soon as possible. And if it was to be left, the building would be gone for future generations. And then you had local TDs saying the same thing as well, that the government had a necessity and obligation to get involved. So when it comes to John Neville, I mean, I've often felt very emotionally entangled with his story, and it's a thrilling and a chilling story in some ways. I think one of the things is that there's a sheer large amount of information about him. And about 6 months ago, I made the decision I was going to print out everything that I had about John on paper rather than just looking on the computer at all these articles. So I printed everything out, and I had a huge pile of paper in front of me. And there's far more information I have about John than other deaf workhouse inmates, far more. And no doubt more information is to come. So John Neville himself was an intelligent man, a literate man, a persistent man, and an ambitious man. He was intelligent. He was well able to read and write. He kept going. He didn't just let his circumstances take him over. He made decisions and he acted on them. He was an educated man as well, and I wouldn't have said that the fact that he was deaf meant that his poverty was preordained. But he made the best of his situation despite the fact that hearing society was not conducive to getting employment. He continually used his talents and advantages to attempt to influence workhouse policy and practice. He remained deeply connected to the deaf community and Irish Sign Language, which he acquired at school. He was a fiercely proud and patriotic Irishman. And really, he was a man for Birr, County Offaly and Ireland, deaf and hearing alike, to remember and celebrate. Thank you very much.